Hello, this is Matthew Arrett, and you're here for another Canadian Patriot podcast. With me today is my good friend John Helmer, who is a journalist. He's somebody who has a very interesting career stretching back quite some decades. And I'm just going to say a few things just reading John's bio. For many of you who are listening, if you don't already know, John is John's main website is Dances with Bears. You can find that at johnhelmer.net. John's bio reads that he has served on the staffs of several leading figures in the past 40 or so years, including U.S. Presidents Jimmy Carter, Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou, Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and I always get his name wrong every single time. He was also an official advisor to Prime Minister J.R. Jayawardene of Sri Lanka. Am I getting that Prime Minister's name right, John?
Jayawardena.
Okay.
Jayawardena. That's how it's pronounced. Equal stress on all the syllables.
Okay. I guess you had a lot of time to practice. And as a lawyer, he has run cases in the district and federal courts in Washington, D.C., in Moscow City Courts, the Victorian Supreme Court, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and the Melbourne Magistrates Court. He has also been an advisor to defense teams in the UK High Court. As a journalist, he is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Moscow and the only Western journalist to direct his Moscow bureau independent of single national or commercial ties, which he opened in 1989 originally. John, that is quite the exceptional biography. And I got to just ask you, before we begin just commenting and discussing some of your recent writings and analyses, as well as the world situation, especially since the Russian counterattack in the wake of the Kerch Bridge sabotage, I'd like to know, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of questions, but when the term Moscow, an independent bureau journalist from Moscow. What does that mean? You were not affiliated particularly with any newspaper outlet or anything. You were just based in Moscow and you were providing journalism and analysis to various other outlets around the world? Or how did that work for so many years?
Well, it worked historically, Matt, but let me thank you for the introduction. And let me say, it's really a pleasure to be back in Montreal. It's been quite a long time. It's one of my favorite Canadian cities, and I've got very sweet memories of having been there as long ago as the World Expo, as I recall it, in 1967, when I met a very interesting group of people, and whose company through a month or two in Montreal at that time, it was the summer of 67, so that's a long time ago, have always encouraged me to think that it would be nice to come back to Montreal, but there's only part of me coming back to the city today, and so thanks for inviting me back. As for how it worked, you might say I've had a career of working for political losers. Whitlam in Australia was destroyed and defeated and removed in November 75. Everybody knows what happened to Jimmy Carter, but in the short-lived single-term administration between 77 and 1980. And then Andreas Papandreou served for 2 terms and then was defeated in the elections that ran between 88 and 92 and later sadly died. So after all those political defeats, you might say, and they were serious ones, they did permanent damage to those countries. And I include the United States in that. Serious damage to the political cultures and serious damage to the quality of the democracy of those countries. I went on to the then Soviet Union and arrived around 1989 and the only way I thought to stay was to set up a bureau that offered coverage from Moscow at a lower price, essentially, than it cost. At that time, at the end of the Soviet Union, or the last days, the last years of the Soviet Union, you could do what I was proposing to do, but nobody else had done it. And you could do it at a lower cost, a lower establishment cost. News media of the established kind used to have fork out about $250,000 in office expenses and cars and hirings of all sorts. And I was offering to do it much cheaper. Of course, at the time, and I'm laughing about it now, but imagine this, at the time I started, you weren't a journalist, a foreign journalist, once accredited, was not allowed to transmit through his own fax machine. We used to transmit by fax. And so I used to have to take a metro across town. Moscow's a rather big town, but a rather good metro system, to the single official fax where you had to file the copy and pay the bill and obviously get monitored, censored, watched, not censored, but watched and monitored as you sent out the fax material. So everything required me to prepare the text, take a 1 or 2 hour trip across town, fax it to whichever newspaper happened, and that's how it worked. Fairly primitive, but it was a one way of learning my way around the town. And the way it worked, various subscribing newspapers or media groups joined in. The Singapore Straits Times, Business Times joined. So I was the first to cover Moscow directly for Singapore, subsequently Bangkok, Australia was another subscriber, and so on. And it expanded over the years. But then this partly reflects the history of the political history that everybody knows during the early years of the Yeltsin administration. And well, let's go back. The fall of Gorbachev happened outside my kitchen window when two very large military forces assembled in the area that was visible outside of my apartment kitchen window, first in 91 and then again in 96. The history, the political history of the fall of Gorbachev and the rise and fall of Yeltsin was a short period of time in which most Western media, Asian or Australasian or European or American, because I went to work ultimately for the Journal of Commerce in New York, and Platts Metals, also a McGraw-Hill publication in New York. The interest in political turmoil in Russia quickly waned, and what came instead was interest in how each country or each economy was doing or might do business with the new Russian economy. So that led me to becoming a specialist in, or having to become a specialist in Russian business sectors, diamonds, precious metals, platinum and gold, the steel, ferrous metals, non-ferrous metals like aluminium, and so on and so on, and insurance, shipping, and with a bit of luck, and I needed luck all those years. There was plenty of bad luck too. The portfolio of independent subscribers and media expanded, and I had to become and I had to learn the businesses of all these specialized media. And that introduced me to Africa and South Africa, because South Africa, as everybody understands, is one of the world's great producers of diamonds, gold, and the platinum group metals. And in '94, apartheid collapsed and was replaced by the Mandela government. And so I began to make the acquaintance of my very good friends in South Africa, and I became South Africa's correspondent, and that was the first African direct news bureau representing interests in Africa in Moscow. So that's how it happened, and a lot of it was happenstance, a lot of it was luck, a lot of it reflected the change of political and business and economic conditions in Russia, and that's the sequence.
That I really do appreciate that context. It does add a lot of meat to the bones. And you were just in the middle of a period of rich history, which saw major battles being waged. At what point did you pick up on the fact that that there was an intention ultimately by the victors of the Cold War to undo effectively the existence of Russia throughout the 1990s and beyond that? At what point did you realize that there was this other geopolitical agenda behind the business talk and things of that sort? Was that something you picked up on early, or was that a little bit later after the color revolutionary launches of Georgia and Ukraine in 2003 and 2004 that you began to understand that?
It's a good historical question, and it allows me to say I forgot to mention the way I got acquainted and integrated in the Canadian press system.